So I want to welcome everybody. My name is Mark Winfield, and I'm Professor of Environmental and Urban Change here at York University in Toronto. And I'm also co-chair of the Sustainable Energy Initiative at the Faculty of Environmental and Urban Change. Um, as part of our ongoing SEI webinar series, I'm pleased to welcome Rebecca Bromley-Trujillo to speak about the state of climate policy in the United States, which has drawn a lot of interest. And I'm very curious to hear as well about what's happening. And Becky focuses particularly on subnational activity, which in the current context may make a lot of sense in terms of where things may be happening. Becky is an associate professor of political science at Christopher Newport University in Virginia. She also serves as research director of the Watson Center for Civic Leadership. She received her MA and PhD from Michigan State University, I believe a student of Barry Rabe, as I understand it. In political science, their research focuses primarily on U.S. climate change policy and state politics. And as with all events at York University, I want to begin with a land acknowledgement, recognizing that we're in a virtual mode. And so you may not be in the same geographic location as I am in Southern Ontario on the Lake Ontario shoreline. And in that context, I invite you to reflect on the history of occupation and around the lands and locations and colonization where you may be. York University acknowledges its presence on lands whose occupation predates the establishment of the university. The area's Takaranto has been caretaken by the Huron-Wendat, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Anishinaabeg, and Métis people. It is now home to many Inuit, First Nations, and Métis people. We in particular want to acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, and also acknowledge that this region is subject to the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. With that, I want to introduce our speaker and also to lay our usual ground rules for these events. The arrival of the Trump administration has had, to put it mildly, disruptive effects on both Canadian and global relationships around trade, around energy, around security, and around the environment. And today we want to focus in particular on that dimension of this process, looking at the effects of the administration's policies on climate policy in the United States, particularly looking at the subnational level, but also perhaps reflecting on where things may go from here at the national level as well. As is our normal procedure with these events, we'll hear from our speaker first, and then we'll go into question and answer. So I'm going to ask people to hold any questions until Becky has finished her presentation. I'd ask people to use the raise hand function. If you have a question, we're deliberately doing this in meeting mode as opposed to webinar mode to provide for better interaction with our speakers. So you can leave your camera on or off if you want if you're asking questions. We will also have the chat going. And MESJD student John James Strantz is helping me out here. He'll be keeping an eye on what happens in the chat, because we know questions and conversations happen there, and we may bring some of that to the main conversation as things evolve. With that, I'm going to hand over to Becky, and I think you've got a presentation that we're going to do a screen share around.
Yes, thank you so much for the warm introduction. It's a pleasure to talk with you all today. I will go ahead and share my screen. Okay.
We've got it.
Can you see it? Yes. Okay. All right. So I will walk us through a bit of the evolution of US climate policy, but focus more on where we're at currently, certainly. But I think it helps to get a sense of where we started. And so I will begin there. And just to give you a broad picture of what has happened in the United States, I think it's helpful to think about the context. And so first, I will generally say that US climate policy began as a subnational policy effort. Early on, the federal government was either unable or unwilling to really advance any sort of major climate policies. And so states and localities stepped up and filled those policy voids. And then we did see some really major federal inflection points during the Obama administration and the Biden administration in terms of advancing climate policy. And then we see a retreat during Trump, I'll say 1.0 and 2.0 for the remainder of this conversation to kind of capture those two different terms. But essentially, both of the Trump terms have engaged in significant policy retrenchment, but even more so during the current term. And I'll get into that in this talk as well. And then, really, throughout this process, subnational governments have been heavily involved, and that has been the case since the mid 1990s to present day, with certainly some variation that I will cover as well. So I want to start by saying that the US is a very polarized nation politically, and this is broadly speaking true, but on the environment, it's actually the most polarized issue currently when it comes to sort of the big picture. So if you ask folks what their priorities are for policy, for Democrats and Republicans, those answers are very different. And so climate change rises to usually the top three issues for Democrats and not at all in the top for Republicans. And then when you get into the questions of whether US climate, or not US, whether climate change is human caused, there are some differences by party there. I will note, though, that the public is less polarized on specific policy proposals, but political elites tend to be very polarized when it comes to our members of Congress, presidents, and state government leaders as well. And in addition, kind of throughout the period of climate policy developments, there's been an extensive climate denial campaign and misinformation campaign, really with an effort to undermine the science of climate change, essentially using a playbook that was used by the tobacco industry before it to undermine that science and weaken and essentially make people feel like we didn't need to advance climate policy. Eventually, that misinformation campaign was more focused on the idea that, okay, maybe climate change is here, but it's too costly to address. And so this has been something that I know certainly in Canada, we've seen this as well. Now, in terms of the initial policy efforts, like I said, federal attempts were scarce or they weren't able to pass policy. And so the US, while initially was a signatory to the Kyoto Protocol, they did not ratify it. Congress did not ratify it. And then George W. Bush said that we were not going to continue as a signatory. So we were, the US federal government tried to adopt a carbon cap and trade program for almost a decade and failed to do so for a variety of reasons, including infighting within the environmental side and the Democratic side, whether this was the best strategy. And then, of course, from the other side, essentially an argument that this would harm the US economy. And so that was effectively killed over that period. Now, in terms of state policy, this is really where, okay, federal government is not going to act. States do tend to engage and step up when there are federal policy vacuums. And we see this on a variety of policy issues, including climate change. In terms of what states have done, I won't go through all of these in detail in the interest of time, but I just wanted to give you a sense of what states have tried to do. The most common policy tools are renewable portfolio standards and net metering. These, the RPS establishes a minimum standard for how much renewable energy will be in the energy mix by a specified date. Net metering allows individuals to connect to the energy grid with renewable sources and earn credits back if they produce excess energy. We also saw states engage in setting targets for greenhouse gas emission reduction, establishing climate action plans to essentially map out what they're going to do over time. And we also saw some carbon pricing in 2005 with the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. Now, in terms of local efforts, so I know for some it's surprising that local governments would even get involved because there are direct costs but diffuse benefits. But local governments saw co-benefits in getting involved in terms of reducing costs related to energy efficiency and reducing air pollutants. And so there were some positives in terms of co-benefits and also some political incentives as well. And certainly for some, living in a community that's more green environmentally was a benefit. So you did see localities doing energy efficiency programs, green building standards, and joining sustainability networks that offered them ideas, best practices, ways of moving forward. Now, I said I'd talk about the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. This is how it started. So the first carbon cap and trade program in the US was regional, and it started with these 11 states. It does not look like this now, and there are more states on the West Coast that have a carbon cap and trade program. So when you look to the RGGI, the original over there, you see that the state I live in, Virginia, is not in it at the moment. And that's because our Republican governor withdrew the state from RGGI through the executive branch. That was challenged in court. And the initial court decision is that he could not withdraw Virginia from RGGI in this way because it was passed through legislation. But he's appealed, and so we're still currently not in it. Pennsylvania also just this week announced that they are not going to be in the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. So we've seen some ebbing and flowing there. New Jersey also left for a period of time, but returned at some point. And then, of course, on the West Coast, you all are probably more familiar because California has a link with Quebec in terms of their emission trading program, and they have a multi-sector program as well. And then in terms of Washington State, they are in talks to join with California and Quebec in emissions trading, although it has not happened yet. So that's, again, how it started, how it's going. Now, back to the presidency. So really, we see an opening of federal actions in large part in response to a Supreme Court decision. So the Massachusetts v. EPA case is about whether greenhouse gases can be established as a pollutant under the Clean Air Act. And this case is a 5-4 decision and essentially said, yes, the EPA can regulate greenhouse gases through the Clean Air Act. And as a result, the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency in the United States, established a couple of years later the endangerment finding, indicating that there are 6 greenhouse gases that do cause public harm, and so can be regulated and should be regulated by the EPA. As a result, the Obama administration established the Clean Power Plan, which placed limits on emissions from the power sector in states with varying targets depending on the state. Now, this was immediately challenged in court, and so is never actually implemented, but still recognize that it was a large federal effort by the Obama administration. Now, arguably, the biggest thing that Obama did was join the Paris Climate Agreement, bringing the US onto that world stage. We'd essentially taken a back seat for a long time. And so we enter those talks and we're involved in the world stage. This is a huge inflection point for federal climate policy in the US. He also signed a law that included $90 million in renewable energy investments, which at the time was the largest federal investment in renewable energy. So again, another sort of notable change there. While this is all going on, states and localities continue to advance their climate commitments. And so they tended to adopt more stringent renewable portfolio standards. And so this map gives you a sense of what those look like today. So it is true that some states engaged in policy retrenchment, so reversals or weakening their standards during this time, but most states that were already active became even more active and set higher, stronger goals for their renewable portfolio standards. Other states added clean energy standards, which the only difference between these two is that clean energy standards includes things like nuclear and carbon offsets. Virginia is one of those states that has a 100% clean energy standard, renewable portfolio standard in Virginia. Apologize for that. And so you do see a lot of states active here. Um, Again, some retrenchment. Texas originally had an RPS goal, but later rescinded it. Although Texas, even despite that, has still advanced a lot of wind and solar energy, in part because of their capacity to do so. Now, when it comes to federal policy, you see Trump step in and basically reverse everything that the Obama administration tried to do. And most of the effort here was through the executive branch, almost all of it. So, first, he appointed individuals to head the EPA and the Department of Interior and the Department of Energy that were generally confrontational to the missions of the agencies that they were representing. And so, his initial appointees were all individuals that were involved in the fossil fuel industry, generally speaking, had experience pushing back on the EPA in past roles. And so they were generally carrying out a mission of the Trump administration that was deregulatory in nature. And so they used the rules and regulations process in the United States to either weaken, rescind, or replace various Obama climate and environmental initiatives. They also took major aim at science. And so they essentially got rid of or restructured boards of scientists that were meant to review rules and regulations. So really pulled them out of the process. And so that made a major difference. In addition, presidents have the ability to sign executive orders independent of Congress, though they do have to align with existing law. And so they are certainly subject to court challenges. But there were many climate and environmental reversals through executive order. And Trump notably withdrew the US from the Paris Agreement, although at that time it took 4 years to go into effect. And so they essentially never fully left it, although they didn't do much in terms of negotiation during this time period, but they did not actually leave it until the very end. And then when Biden stepped in, he brought us back into the Paris Agreement. Still, Trump 1.0 had no major climate changes through legislation, which is important because legislation tends to have a longer standing impact than does executive branch activity. Because if you make changes through the executive branch, the next president can essentially undo all of it pretty easily. And so it's not that it's not impactful. Certainly, Trump 1.0 delayed a lot of climate policy. However, the legacy of that was shorter. Now, when when Trump is still in office, the state and local governments really did push back. So half the states joined an alliance saying that they were going to still progress towards the Paris Agreement goals, even if we were no longer going to be part of it. There were local governments that joined a mayoral compact similar to that. And in addition to that, state attorneys general, which are one of the most powerful state actors in pushing back on federal policy or federal actions of the president, many state attorneys general fought back and sued the Trump administration. This was arguably the most effective state strategy for pushing back on Trump in his first term because he was generally, his administration was pretty messy in terms of their rolling back of environmental policy, and they did not follow procedure. And so we have something called the Administrative Procedures Act, which requires a number of steps if you're going to rescind or weaken a rule or regulation. And generally, his team did not follow those rules. And so lawsuits were pretty successful during this time. And many of the things that Trump did during his first term were blocked by the courts. Now, we also saw lots of states advancing more stringent climate policies. And that said, some states were also engaging in retrenchment. And so usually this reflects the political context of the states. So states that had Democratic leadership tended to advance climate policy. States that shifted to Republican leadership tended to engage in retrenchment. So just some examples, states like Ohio, Kentucky, Indiana, all did some policy reversals related to their net metering standards and to their renewable portfolio standards. And so we see this sort of backward effort going on in the states. But other states mostly responded to Trump by being more aggressive in their environmental targets. We also saw lots of public protests during the first Trump term, even more this time. Now, Biden steps in, and this is another major inflection point in federal policy on climate. So certainly he went in and quickly appointed folks that had scientific backgrounds and were in alignment with the mission of the EPA and the Department of Interior and other agencies that deal with environmental policy. And so in addition, he quickly rejoined the Paris Agreement and reset the US as a potential leader on the world stage. He also passed signed several executive orders and made rule changes and regulatory changes that would help advance renewable energy and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So focus on the methane emissions from the oil and gas industry. And certainly, I didn't have it on a bullet point on this slide, but he also engaged in a lot of efforts focused on environmental justice. So directing funds and projects to communities that are disadvantaged or marginalized. Now, major federal legislation that came through the Biden administration, and this is really the first time that we've seen major climate policy get adopted through Congress. And that includes the Infrastructure and Jobs Act, which made a lot of changes, but in terms of climate, really the most central feature was the electric vehicle infrastructure. So expanding out charging stations across the US. And the Inflation Reduction Act, this is the singularly largest federal program to address climate change that's ever been adopted. It's really about offering incentives. So it's not a mandate to cut emissions, rather it's incentives, tax credits, subsidies to individuals, to corporations, to governments, to build out the renewable energy network and really focus on expanding solar and wind and other projects of that nature. And so this is a huge investment. And although it wasn't as expansive as Biden wanted it to be, his initial effort through the Build Back Better law failed. But the Inflation Reduction Act still was a pretty huge change in US policy. That said, that changed pretty quickly when Trump came back into office. Now, I will also note that during this time, states have continued advancing climate policy. And so much of their actions have centered on environmental justice. So again, addressing the fact that environmental contaminants, including climate issues, tend to center in marginalized communities of color, poor communities. And so that's a lot of state action is kind of focused on addressing those harms. And in addition, states like New York and Vermont have adopted pretty significant laws. They're essentially climate superfund laws that try to force fossil fuel companies to pay for climate harms that occur in their states. Now, these were immediately challenged in court, initially by fossil fuel entities, but recently the Trump administration joined in these lawsuits. So we'll have to see how that plays out. Now, there have been some recent subnational challenges that this is my area, so I've done a lot of research on this, but essentially, even in states where they have pretty aggressive renewable portfolio standards or clean energy standards, we are seeing some unique challenges in expanding out renewable energy. Of course, it's also the case that many states have passed no major climate policy, especially red states or conservative or Republican-led states. Now, when it comes to the actual deployment of renewables, one of the problems is how difficult it is to obtain permits. That process is very messy and complex. And so one of the things that I think a lot of states and the federal government are looking to do is streamline the permitting process for deployment of renewables. Now, in several states, including the state I live in, Virginia, there have been local governments pushing back on the siting of wind and solar. And this has really been very complicated because local governments tend to be many of these local governments are in rural areas. And there has been concern that agricultural land will get subsumed by solar farms. And so there are some local concerns about that. And then there's also rampant misinformation being spread on the idea that solar panels and offshore wind are harmful to wildlife. Just to give you an example of what is all over US social media is things like this, that essentially offshore wind is killing whales. Now, there is no scientific evidence that this is true, but it's all over social media, and it's being fueled by a large network of think tanks and fossil fuel industry folks that are spreading this information, in addition to political elites and more conservative media. Now, that's offshore wind. When it comes to the siting of solar, the misinformation is rampant. So if you go into like a local meeting that's discussing approving a solar project, I've heard things like solar panels create radiation and kill livestock or sheep. I've heard that when they put solar panels on the land, that all of the plants in that area all die. These are things that people are being told and is incorrect. So it's a real struggle to kind of get accurate information into these communities. Now, the other challenge at the subnational level is around energy demand, which is skyrocketing because of AI data centers. And just to give you a sense of what that looks like in Virginia, we are the data center capital of the entire US. We have more data centers than anyone else globally, even. And these data centers use a lot of power, and so they strain our electric grid. And so while states like Virginia do have a 100% renewable portfolio standard by 2050, it will be difficult to meet that because the rise in demand of energy due to data centers has really constrained our ability to kind of shut down fossil fuels. And so we're seeing our electric utility, Dominion Energy in Virginia, essentially saying we can't close down these fossil fuel plants like we thought because we won't have enough energy to kind of meet this demand. And this isn't just Virginia, other states like Georgia and Texas also have a lot of data centers, and other states are considering adding more as well. And so it's a general problem. Now, Trump 2.0 comes in, basically starts off similar to his first term in reversing rules and regulations and withdrawing from Paris. And this is a bigger deal this time because it can do it within a year at this point. And so we will leave Paris. That is a given. And we will leave it for at least a few years, depending on what our next president or who our next president is. We may or may not return for quite some time. Now, in terms of Trump's actions in this term, they have been much more targeted and punitive. So he seems to really have an axe to grind when it comes to offshore wind and solar and onshore wind in particular. And so he has aggressively gone after state policies too. He's signed a large-scale executive order saying that the Department of Energy should essentially seek out state policies that do not align with his energy goals. And his energy goals are essentially to expand fossil fuels, and that's the primary goal. Now, he has also rescinded parts of the Inflation Reduction Act through legislation in a law called the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, which is an interesting title. But the One Big Beautiful Bill Act didn't fully roll back the Inflation Reduction Act, just certain aspects, but it does make it absolutely harder to build out renewable energy. It slows it down. And the EPA is also looking into potentially overturning the endangerment finding, which would be a pretty huge blow to federal executive branch activity to address greenhouse gases. In addition, as you've, I'm sure, heard, there's been a lot of US-Canada frustration over this. The trade war, the tariffs, these things are making renewables more challenging because they increase the cost of the components that are involved in solar panels and other things. And so that's also slowing down our renewable energy transition. Now, we are seeing a similar response from the original Trump 1.0 to now. That said, the lawsuits are progressing in a different way, in part because the courts are different. Our courts are more conservative leaning than they were the last go around. And so that's been more challenging. In addition, Trump's sort of unique approach to attacking states and their offshore wind policies are making states wary of continuing with their aggressive climate policies. Just in the last few weeks, Massachusetts and New York have shown some reticence and continuing with their original climate programs because they are worried they're going to be blamed for high energy prices and they think they need to maybe weaken them. They're also worried that they'll eventually get sued if they don't meet their climate targets. And the reason they maybe are not meeting them is because Trump is making it difficult for them to do things like offshore wind that they were counting on. In addition, what remains to be seen is kind of what will happen if cases make their way to the Supreme Court, which is much more conservative. But so far, there's been a mix. Federal judges have at times blocked Trump's executive changes. At others, they have given him the go-ahead. And on offshore wind specifically, this has been really complex. So in some cases, when Trump issued a stop work order, the court ended up siding with the company or the state, saying, no, you can continue your offshore wind programs. And others, for instance, just this week or last week, a federal judge said, actually, the Trump administration can revisit a permit that was awarded to an offshore wind project under the Biden administration. Essentially, they can revoke it and re-examine it, which sets a very tough court precedent moving forward. So that's where we're at. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I'm happy to take any questions that you have.
That's great, Becky. Thanks. That's an amazing overview of the situation and how it's evolved, and I'm sure it's going to prompt some questions. As I mentioned, we're going to ask people to use their raise hand function. If you do have questions, you can put things in the chat as well, and JJ is going to keep an eye on that, but it may take a minute or two to get to that. We'll take questioners in the room first. While people are formulating, I mean, one thing I did want to ask about, in particular, what seems different this time is that with Trump won, there's a focus on the federal jurisdiction, and there didn't seem to be that much sort of effort to sort of block states explicitly from doing things. And in Trump 2, we now seem to be, you hinted at this with the offshore wind and other things. I understand I'm trying to withdraw some of the California authorizations as well. So how is that the case, and how systemic is this? Because this would seem to be something new to be seeing a reach that far down to try and head off subnational governments.
Yes, in fact, Barry Rabe calls this shakedown federalism, and I absolutely agree. So
I got to write that one down.
Yes, this is unique to Trump 2.0. It's now some of it I don't think will be successful. His sort of broad-based executive order to search and destroy state policies, I think, will be difficult to implement. But his attacking of offshore wind has been effective and very detrimental, and in ways that I mentioned, but I'll also add that he has withdrawn funding for things like setting up ports to be able to take in offshore wind turbines or things of that nature. And so that has been very harmful to states that were planning to deploy offshore wind, and it's going to have a long legacy of impact. So this is different from his first administration, where really a lot of his actions were blocked and didn't necessarily have an incredibly long impact. This is different, and so states are really at a disadvantage, and the context is just much more difficult.
Okay. I mean, as I was mentioning in an earlier session, we see a little bit of this in relation to provinces and municipal governments now happening as well, of this reach in, which we've not necessarily seen before. Um, I see one question in the chat from Rohan. Um, and this is um, asking about financing on clean energy, particularly how is that changing in terms of banks looking at declaring fossil fuels as higher risk assets?
So we are seeing some of this movement, and some of this is reflected in the protests we're seeing in the U.S. Among college students in particular, kind of arguing for essentially moving away from investments in fossil fuels. And so, yes, I would say that we are seeing some of this fossil fuels being higher risk assets. Yes, whether it's going to really sort of prevent the trajectory that we're seeing of the slowdown we're seeing, I'm a little less certain about.
Further questions? I've got one while people are digesting. Um, I'm particularly interested. We have this relationship between California and Quebec, which is sort of the vestige of the WCI thing. Um, and is there any movement in California that would suggest a backing away from that? And then secondly, is there any chance of other states joining those kinds of relationships?
So right now, it appears California is really wanting to push back on Trump, and so that is one of the states that has kind of continued pushing back and doesn't seem to be backing off. Whereas states like New York and others really do appear to be nervous about continuing their advancement of climate policy. California is not, and so I do think that will continue, and that's been a longstanding connection. Really, I think it's back since 2014. Now, Washington, it really does look like they're engaging in talks to join this. They do have to take a series of steps to be able to do so. But I do get a sense that they may be joining very soon. And so other states, I think it's less likely in this environment, but we'll see. Yes.
No, that'd be very interesting because I think there's then ongoing nervousness in Quebec. Anders, question.
Yeah, I'm here in Nova Scotia where there's been a lot of talk about large-scale offshore wind development, possibly with some of that going towards exports into the northeastern United States. And with the restrictions that Trump has put on offshore wind development in the US, there is an idea that some of these states in the Northeast that still have their clean energy goals will now turn towards imports from Nova Scotia to meet their clean energy goals. Do you have a sense of, well, the degree to which that's being considered and whether that's a likely possibility, or would the Trump administration also try to put obstacles towards that form of wind energy development?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I do have, yes, I've definitely heard about these talks, and certainly I think it's a real possibility, especially as they sort of lose the ability to do their original plans. Uh, I do think the Trump administration will try to push back on this, although the mechanism to me at this moment is a little less clear. But so far, he's essentially done everything he could think to do to kill offshore wind. And it's, I mean, he has sort of a long-standing vendetta against wind, and I don't mean to make light of this, but like even going back to 2016, in public speeches, he was saying that wind farms cause cancer, or that they killed birds. They're killing all the birds. I mean, these are just common statements that he made back then. He also has had this sort of long-standing vendetta in part because in a Scotland golf course that he had, they were planning to build a wind farm that he thought would obstruct the view, and he was very upset about this. So there's a lot of like very weird, peculiar reactions by Trump to offshore wind. And so yes, I think he would do literally anything he could think of to stop it, but the mechanism there may be less clear, so that might be more difficult for him to stop.
Interesting. One of the questions we've had come up in the chat, and I don't know, Becky, if you can speak to this. asking questions about changes that the Trump administration is making to the Office of Indian Energy Policy and programs within the Department of Energy.
So I know less about this specifically. I know that there have been grants pulled that were going to be dedicated to indigenous communities to address climate resilience in particular. And so as part of his changes, his sort of, I don't know what you all hear in Canada about this, but he's very against what he calls DEI. And so literally anything that is meant to go to a marginalized community or a community of color, he calls DEI, and so has tried to pull back funds through various departments, including the Department of Energy. But I know less specifically about the Office of Indian Energy Policy, so I can't speak as much to that. But it's not looking good. Yeah.
A couple of others from the chat asking period of the state level. I mean, how has scaling impacted clean energy in the sense that I think the implication here is has this reached scales at the state level where it's sort of acquiring momentum of its own that are kind of independent of what might happen at the federal level?
So yes, I would say there are many states that they've been engaging in independent climate policy effort for so long that they are starting to see a much larger range of sources of renewable energy. That said, it's basically Trump's actions are really kind of slowing that down, but mostly in the wind and solar. So I do have some hope for things like geothermal to still continue to take off, because he's taken less aim at that. And even in his widespread executive order that was essentially arguing for a fossil fuel dominant energy regime, he did specifically mention geothermal as okay. So maybe there are some types of energy that aren't solar and wind that will still continue to advance under a Trump administration.
No geothermal threats to his golf clubs.
Yeah, yes.
This is an interesting one here. More in the federal level, but a question in the chat again. The relationship with China and the fact that China appears to be moving ahead on clean energy technologies, be it EV, solar panels. What impact is that having on the narrative in the U.S., if anything? Like, is there an argument being made about being left behind at this stage, or is that kind of argument having any tractions?
It's definitely an argument that Democrats are making and liberals and environmental groups are making, but it's really not breaking through. In fact, in ways I was surprised at how easy it was for the Trump administration to get a repeal of parts of the Inflation Reduction Act through Congress, because there were several Republicans who, they preside over districts that absolutely would have been or were benefiting from the Inflation Reduction Act. And the argument was that, hey, we need to advance more quickly. China is well ahead of us. And if we want to have the sort of jobs and so on in the US and sort of benefit from that, then we need to keep these incentives in place. And so even in Virginia, in a district that's right next to mine, there is a arguably pretty vulnerable member of the US House who argued or advocated that we should not roll back any of the Inflation Reduction Act standards, as she's a Republican. But she still ended up voting for the One Big Beautiful Bill Act that did rescind much of the Inflation Reduction Act. And so it seems like, yes, Republicans are aware that it's harmful for the economy and that China will probably advance. I mean, they already are advanced well ahead of the US, but even further. And yet that is just not breaking through, and the Trump administration sort of full steam ahead, and the Republican Party is really hesitant to push back on him. Now, I am curious, not that we want to talk about Epstein, but the sort of controversy going on around the president and Jeffrey Epstein, certainly if that gets far enough, it's possible that it will weaken Trump's influence on the Republican Party. And so maybe we'll see some kind of pushback on Trump then, but thus far, Republicans have essentially rolled over, even in places where they were absolutely harmed by the overturning of aspects of the IRA. And so the argument that China is advancing well beyond us has not been able to kind of break that mold, if you will.
I mean, another question in the chat, but that big, larger question, because I have a student who's working on this very question of that somehow the normal political survival instincts of politicians somehow seem to be not kicking in, that this was designed very specifically into the Inflation Reduction Act to make sure that money was flowing to Republican districts. And yet, despite that, it's, as you say, they've sort of seen the money pulled back. I that just as someone who studies U.S. politics, do you have any insight on what is going on here that normally one would expect politicians' political survival instincts to override anything else at the end of the day, and yet we see now this extraordinary situation at the moment where those political laws of gravity almost seem to be suspended.
Yes, in ways it's shocking, in ways it's not. And the reason I'll say it's not is because in the United States, the way the Republican Party operates right now, it's very much a purity loyalty test situation where if you're a Republican that goes against the president or against other Republicans, then you are called a rhino or Republican in name only, and you are ostracized. And this is especially true through our primary system. So if you're a Republican that pushes back on the president, then you are going to get a primary challenge from your right. And it's actually very likely that you will lose it. And this is not the same in the Democratic Party. There are not generally primary challengers from the left kicking out more establishment or moderate Democrats. This is a thing on the Republican side. And so for these Republicans, they have a greater fear of being challenged within their own party than they do losing a general election. And part of that is also that some of our districts are gerrymandered in such a way that you can't lose your seat at the general election, but you could lose it if you lose in the primary. And so it shifts the power dynamics and in such a way that I think a lot of Republicans are afraid to push back on Trump for that reason, and also because he does still command a lot of money in the party and kind of the flow of dollars. And so there's that aspect as well.
I hadn't thought of that the possibility that they've so gerrymandered themselves in that they don't worry about the general election and just worry about the primary.
Yep, that's exactly right.
That's an extraordinary situation. Coming back again to the chat question, I think we'll wrap up soon. Again, I think this is sort of in the category of looking for ways in to try and get the administration to pay attention to climate. And we sort of talked about China. We've talked about direct political self-interest. Question here about, that the Department of Defense had been identifying climate as a security issue. And again, well, we've seen Hexas, there's seems again there just no connection at all. That again, this one just doesn't land. And the response, trade, security, political interest, it sort of begs the question: is there any angle that might work with the Trump administration around climate and energy transitions?
I have not really seen one to work yet, and I'm not sure what it would be. I think, yes, the Department of Defense has gone the total other way. They've essentially hidden the reports that they previously, I've tried to show in my classes reports from the past, and I click on the link and it's gone. And this is a really common issue right now. they're just wiping clean the various agency websites of information on climate. And so, yes, the Department of Defense has for a long time said it's a national security issue. And it's also influential in terms of where a lot of our military bases are. I mean, in Virginia, we are a huge military area, and Norfolk is, you know, arguably in the worst position on the entire East Coast when it comes to sea level rise. So there's a huge issue with our naval bases, all kinds of things. And the Department of Defense was well aware of that, but they've essentially stopped saying that. And so it's a huge shift. And I mean, that's, yeah. No, I'm not sure. I mean, Trump so despises science and scientists. I mean, for him, those are the elites that we are fighting against. And so kind of changing his mind on that is difficult.
Yeah, but it's also striking the depth of the reach in terms of in Trump 1. I don't think we saw this sort of erasure of the science and disappearance of information that we seem to be seeing now, which is systemic. And I'm both, it's one just the thing itself, and then two, like what level of preparation and organization it must have be taking to hunt all of this down, given the sprawling institution that is the United States government. And yet it seems to be reaching to extraordinary depths within the system, which you would have thought would have been safe for the 4 years because they just never get there. And now that seems it's almost inexplicable.
Yeah, I think it's in part. So I don't know how much y'all hear about something called Project 2025 in Canada, but there's this blueprint that was established by a conservative think tank, and Russell Vought has essentially been executing it. And so part of it is this dismantling of the scientific information, and yeah, so it's just all kind of gone. And I mean, just this week I was teaching an environmental justice lecture to my students and talking about the past environmental justice policies of presidents, and there used to be an environmental justice scorecard you could look at data, and that's gone. I mean, it's all gone. And it's, yeah, I think there are folks in there that know exactly what they're doing and how to do it. Trump is not necessarily one of them, but he's brought in people that can do it.
This is the extreme. He seems to have been able to bring in people who know where to look and how
For
to
sure.
look and are being very, very efficient at it.
Mm-hmm.
Which then has cascading effects from us because we're I'm afraid big science freeloaders, and we use
Sure.
U.S. it's been a soft form of soft
Very
power for the United
understandable.
States that the baseline data on everything, emission standards, everything else comes from the US EPA or NREL or wherever else. And we're just beginning to think about the impact of that elsewhere. But it does also seem an extraordinary loss of soft power for the US because that was the entree into every conversation on the planet, was that the United States brought with it all this information and all this data.
Yeah.
It's again
Very
just part
true.
of this extraordinary situation that we seem to find ourselves in. Another question here, and I think we may wrap in a minute as we're running as we slow down a bit. But a question about what are your prospects on the midterms? How is that? I mean, is that looking like a break, or are we going to need another general election, a new president for things to change? And this is a big question in Canada at the moment. That do we rag the puck in our relationship with our prime minister is very fond of hockey analogies, and do
Yes.
we rag the puck to the midterms? Or are we more likely stuck for the longer term here out to 2028?
As far as renewable energy and climate policy is concerned, I don't think the midterms will be enough to solve it, but maybe to stall some of his actions potentially. So So generally, the way U.S. midterms work is that the party in power in the White House loses seats. The question is more of how many seats are they going to lose? And Trump has a very low popularity, and so that tends to lead to more seats lost. And now Virginia just had state elections, and sometimes Virginia acts as a bellwether. Essentially, how bad is it for the president there? Then it may be as bad a year from now in the midterms. And in Virginia, Democrats took huge victories, unprecedented. They won all the statewide offices, but also flipped like 13 seats in the House, and so that suggests that people are pretty upset with the president because state elections are nationalized in the US. And so I would guess if things continue the way they are right now, that Trump will remain unpopular and that he will lose lots of seats, particularly in the House. That said, there are some structural challenges. You've seen the gerrymandering discussions. So Texas obviously redrawing lines to potentially add seats for Republicans, California trying to respond. But more Republican states have moved forward with redistricting than Democratic states. So California helps counter it, but not all the way. And so that's a challenge. The other challenge is that in the US Senate, there is currently a structural disadvantage for Democrats because of how our senators are distributed evenly across the states. And so because Democrats tend to represent more populous areas, this is complicated. And so basically, and who happens to be up for election in the upcoming midterms in the Senate, it's not a very good map for Democrats. And so they would essentially have to run the board to take back the Senate. And I'm not saying that's not possible, but it's definitely not likely, is what I would say. Now, if Trump's party takes as much of a beating as it did in the Virginia and New Jersey elections that just happened, then Democrats absolutely could very narrowly take the Senate. That would be a much bigger deal because the Senate has so much more additional power than the House does, really. So it will make a change, but I think it's more of a stopping the bleeding rather than kind of reverting course.
We're not moving forward until we have a change in administration, is what it sounds like.
Yeah, and so really that means, and that's why states and localities will be so important, because if we're not really advancing climate policy at the federal level, then the sort of answer is the state and local governments.
And on that note, I think not seeing any further questions. This has been fascinating and incredibly informative. And so I want to thank you for this on behalf of everybody. And I'm sure we'll be in touch. I should mention Becky is one of the contributors to a volume on climate federalism and climate governance that we're working on. A number of the contributors actually in this meeting here now for University of Toronto Press, which we're hoping will be published next year. We'll see how we do. And I think this is going to be hugely informative for that, but also in terms of thinking about how the Canada-US relationship is changing, because we're clearly moved into a space that we on our side of the border never anticipated. I was in a conversation with a former student who now leads a think tank, and there was a serious discussion about whether or not China or the United States were the greater security risk from a Canadian perspective.
I get that. Yeah.
I mean, big is around autos and, the whole business about Chinese EV tariffs, but also what's happening with the Trump administration. But that was which just unbelievable that one would find oneself in a conversation like that at this stage. But that seems to be where we've got to. So thank you very much.
Yeah.
This has been great. We will, as usual, once the Zoom does its thing, we'll post this, and we'll let you know we're as part of the same project. We're hoping to get our Australian contributor to do what Becky has done for us about what's going on in Oz. We just haven't been able to line up the time zones yet. Fortunately, we and
That would be tricky.
yeah, it is. I mean, fortunately, we're in the same time zone, so this worked out okay. Trying to find a time that isn't in the middle of the night for someone, either us or in Australia, is proving to be a much more challenging thing, but we will figure it out. But thank you all very much, and I think we'll wrap here. And thank you, Becky.
Thank you so much, and thanks for all the great questions. Appreciate it.
Great, thank you.
Take care.
Bye-bye. And there we go. Okay, thanks, JJ. We'll do a wrap here. I'm gonna stop the recording. Should have stopped that sooner.